Money is not neutral. It carries culture, history, and expectations.
Join us for honest conversations about the real costs behind how we live, love, give, and just survive in this complex world.
Money. It is not black or white.
Powered by GoTime.
Inna Mapalomaku.
And I'm Maya Fisher-French. Welcome to our podcast.
Maya, I am so incredibly excited for today's podcast. Because today's story, and we have someone very incredible to tell his story, is a story of South Africa, right? It is a story about how a lot of people have had to overcome their own upbringing to succeed and become financially well in our society.
And I think what we've always looked at, and we see so much evidence of that, is what that transition takes and the incredible, what you have to do to overcome your upbringing, but then also perhaps the emotional scars that it brings. And so really excited to have Frank Magwegwe here, who is a professor at GIBS. And Frank, I've known you, I think it's like 10 years now, more than 10 years.
Yes, I think so.
And I do have to tell you, the one thing that I love about you is that you're always so unassuming and you're so interested in other people. You always had this deep connection with people. And I know maybe this is going to sound a bit harsh, but sometimes people, if they've made it and they've succeeded, they feel that they have to put on some kind of performance around that. And you never do. You always arrive.
Thank you for the kind words.
You always arrive with such authenticity. But maybe just give us a little bit of a brief. We're here to talk about your story. You've written your book now.
Yes.
And I just wanted to understand, what is that? Yeah, maybe tell our listeners what that book is about.
Oh, thank you very much for the opportunity. Very happy to be here. I think after about 15 years or so of just being on various platforms, sharing this story, I eventually found myself towards the end of last year just saying, every time I get an opportunity to talk, at the end, people say, where do you get the book? And then I said, oh, sorry, I'm still writing it. I did start in 2016. Then I started my doctorate journey. I put it on hold. And then many things happened in between. So I never really got a chance to sit and just kind of focus and put the ideas on paper. So it's a book about how I navigated some of the biggest challenges I've, ever experienced in my life. And that is early 90s, arriving in Joburg. Briefly staying with my aunt and eventually finding myself homeless, right? I think that's one of the biggest challenges I've experienced in my life. I think coupled with that was also being broke. You don't have money, but you must survive on the streets of Joburg. It's learning to be streetwise because it's quite dangerous, just life on the streets. So it's an opportunity for me to reflect on the journey that I walked in my early 20s. But the other reason behind the book, for me, that experience taught me kind of the power of the human spirit. Kind of when I look back, and often when I share this story, it was like matriculated 91, exactly a later November, I'm on the streets. I'm broke. I'm homeless. I'm unemployed. And if you had asked me during matric, I would have told you that if that happened, I would die. I would never be able to manage it. But there I did, right? So it was just to share a story of overcoming obstacles, but also, I guess, to thank the people who helped it happen. Because often, when we look back, I think the temptation often is I did it by myself. But that's the last thing that happened. I didn't. There were so many people who were part of the story. And so I wanted to bring out really that idea that no man is an island. The idea that often behind this story of someone who overcame homelessness, who now teach at GIBS, there are so many people who made it happen, and therefore, we all have an opportunity to be that person for another person. And I often joke with people, say, my Mrs. Zimmerman, my Evelyn? Are you someone's Evelyn? Because those people were so central in the story that I share in the book.
And I must say, Mapelo, I was saying to Mapelo as well, I said, I knew Frank's story. We know many of us have heard your story, but to read it and to hear about those people, about your gratitude. And I want to read an extract from the book. I was sitting on the plane. I read your book on a plane. By the way, it's really quick and easy to read, but it is so inspirational. It's so worth it. And I just was so struck by something you said. It was Kwaku, who you were in a station. You were living in Park Station, right? You were on a bench.
That's right.
And something had happened, and he said, "Ask for gratitude. Let us pray, not to ask for anything, but to give gratitude." And you wrote, "Something shifted inside me, not a quake, but a small, definite tremor, a crack in the ice of my despair. It was the realization, sharp as the morning cold, that I could either freeze to death on a bench, physically or spiritually, or I could learn, inch by inch, to stand again. The pain didn't leave, and the hunger didn't stop, nor did the memory of fists and feet fade, but I began for the first time to live with the scar instead of dying from the wound. This was no longer about being a victim of the past. It was about becoming a survivor of the present." And for me, that felt like a massive mind shift for you.
It was indeed. And I think what's so interesting about Kwaku, he was very different from us. When I say us, there's this camaraderie among homeless people. But he was homeless, but he was a thinker. And I think part of it, when I look back, it's because he was a teacher, he was a Ghanaian. And I explained in the book that he arrived in Joburg, he was going to teach him Tata, and then he got mugged, and he lost his passport and most of his belongings. That's how he became homeless. And so when I became homeless at the beginning of January 1993, he's one of the first people who befriended me, because we're young and people would know, this, and they would even say, "This Mafikizolo, this person who's just come from Norway, but you can see he's homeless now because you're spending almost all your time at Park Station." So there was something in him about reflecting. If I look back in the language I have today, about thinking, about taking things in perspective. And also, I think maybe he was 8 or 10 years older than me. So I was early 20s, maybe he was approaching 30. But he kind of had this father figure when you used to say to us, "It's not as bad as you making it look like. There are still things to be grateful for." And you have this thing about you're alive, right? And so I'm just giving a bit of that background. But if we come back to that moment, I think if you look at that moment for me, it definitely was a shift in the mindset. And I think it came about because when I became homeless, I was convinced it's not going to be long. I will overcome it quickly. And I remember arriving at Park Station 3 January 1993, it was a Sunday. And so I knew Park Station because I'd arrived there 6 weeks before from Bloemfontein.
With all the hope.
But I never thought I'd come back there so quickly. It's now, that is my home, right? And so I just had this thing that I know how to look for work. I will find a job quickly. And that was going to be my passport, right? In other words, I get work, I earn a salary, I find a place. And I remember maybe a week or so after going to or starting to call Park Station home, guys, I'm going to be quickly out of here. You know me, I walk long distances looking for work, Best Valley, Godriff City, Rosebank, kind of just with this energy. And everybody else, essentially what they said was, it takes much longer than you think. But in a way that you're naive, it's going to take very long. Whereas Kwaku was more, not so much putting you down, but almost like get perspective. It might not be like that. It might be kind of a bit of a journey. So he had always had that way of looking at life. So if we come to the part that we are discussing now, I think for me, because it's taken longer than I thought to be off the streets, I'd go to a lot of churches, just trying to get help. And I didn't get the help that I wanted. I wanted the help of, we can give you a job, you can clean, you can garden, and you pay a little bit of money. Oh, we even offer you accommodation. But I didn't get that. So I was an angry young man. I tried a lot of things to quickly get off the streets. And I was despondent. I was falling into despair because it just didn't pan out as I had thought. So for me, that moment of let's pray, it was just like, wow, here is someone who's been homeless longer than me, who never complains, by the way. It was just about him. He just was a person who didn't complain. Some of us would say, we didn't find any bottles to recycle. We didn't find any food. And it sort of calmed us down. So for me, when I look back with the language I have today, a mindset shift, it's really about your beliefs being challenged, right? It's about your attitudes being in front of you, almost like you see them in a mirror, and something shifts in you. You start to see the world perhaps slightly differently, right? I think for me, that's what happened. To say, I'm going through a lot, but there's someone reminding me that there is, in fact, many things I can be grateful for. I don't have to wait to overcome homelessness. I don't have to wait to get a job. That's what was limiting me. I didn't feel I had anything to be grateful for because I went days without eating, just like other homeless people. And also, not only was it about sort of the physical experience of hunger, of not having shelter. For me, it was more, especially maybe, so it's almost a story of three parts. Maybe kind of the second part of being homeless. For me, it was about dignity. It was about the world wants you to be invisible. In other words, you approach people, they step away because 3 or 4 months of wearing the same clothes, 3 or 4 months of not bathing, just your appearance have deteriorated. And suddenly I could sense that something has shifted. At the beginning, I could approach people and tell them my story. Then they would still say, I'm so sorry what you're going through, but I can't help you, right? But kind of from about April, 3 months into this, I could sense that when people look at me, it's not the person there in January, right? This is a different person. They don't want to talk to you. They don't know what's wrong with you, right? And so I think that's what was eating me. That's what was making me find nothing to be grateful for. There's nothing to be grateful for. At the same time, Kwaku's perspective was, but did you eat something? Yes. Well, that's more thing you can be grateful for it. You safe here, because I was mugged at some point. Mugged. I didn't have anything, right, in Hillbrow. And so it's exactly what I needed, because it was so evident when someone says, well, you found something to eat, you're safe, you've got a place to sleep. And then, of course, he's regularly, he reminded us just to be grateful for being alive, right? So it's so interesting for me when I look back that it's not money. I thought I'd get a job and then homelessness is over. But that, for me, was the beginning of overcoming homelessness. That ability to be grateful.
It started with a mindset.
Yes,
a gratitude, and I find that so powerful.
Yeah.
And that's what it was. It was about a mindset shift and gratitude at a time when, when do you have something to be grateful for? I found that incredibly powerful.
Yeah. But when I was reading the book, I thought to myself, number one, do you know where Kwaku ended up? Because, in the book, it doesn't say.
Yes.
Right? Number one.
It does.
But the second one also, as I was reading the book, I thought to myself, at what point did you feel like, let me just make enough to take a taxi back home? Because in the book, there is nowhere where you mention that whenever I have a little bit enough just to go back to Mthatha, I'm going to do that. What was it about you being in this city or in Bloemfontein that you just had to be here?
Yeah.
Because at any given point, I would have said, well,
I'm going home.
I one-way ticket.
Yes.
I am out of here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a question. Both questions come up a lot in almost every talk. People are struck by kind of Kwaku and just how he handled himself and the guidance and the camaraderie he provided, as well as what made you never think about, oh, I'm out of job if I get a little bit of money. Let me start with Kwaku. So I never saw Kwaku at the end. And I remember running around trying to find him at Park Station when I eventually started at Wits in February 94. And it just like the city swallowed him.
Sure.
I don't know what happened to him. I know he was also in a space of if he could find a help to go home, but it's kind of expensive to get a ticket to go back to Ghana. So it's one of those things that it makes me sad. And I realized when I was writing the book that I had an opportunity to thank Mrs. Zimmerman. I had an opportunity to thank Evelyn. I saw them several years, in fact, after I studied in Wits in 1994. But I was never able even to tell Kweku that I now have an opportunity to go to university. Because when that news broke and I was looking, I just couldn't find him. So I don't know what happened to him. And if you ask me what do I think, I've got a suspicion that just because of who he was and how he thought and his mindset, I think something good also happened. What it is, I don't know. But I think something good, there's also a good ending, to his story. Because I just feel so strongly that he deserved it, given how he was wise counsel, for us as we were struggling and navigating, homelessness.
I want to pick up something there, because in our previous episode, we spoke to Professor Prince Sarpong about providing and the importance of men to provide, how the identity of men around providing. Yeah. And I think of Kwaku's, he provided.
Oh, yeah.
He had no money. Yeah. He was homeless, but look at what he did for you. Look at what he did for the other young men. He provided emotional support. And I just wanted to bring that because I think that really ties into this idea that providing, we always think everything's about money, but sometimes you can help another person simply through wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. So he offered really a lot of non-financial support. And in fact, most of it was around managing emotions, was about staying positive, was about be optimistic. And what's so interesting, Maya, that you mentioned it, I actually don't know if he was that aware of what he was providing to us, because we were all stuck, and he was a little bit older than us, as I said, and we were stuck really in almost the instrumental support. We wanted food, we wanted a job, we wanted money, right? And it's only years later, as I started to reflect on the journey, started to talk about the story, when I realized that, wow, in fact, the foundation of overcoming homelessness for me was that evening. And it wasn't financial support. In fact, it was emotional support or social support, as in kind of, you matter, it's going to be okay.
Mm.
Sure. So the second question about...
Yes, about...
Did you
think about, my account is too much? I didn't. And let me tell you why. I was reflecting on it last night, that when I look back on my journey and overcoming homelessness, a lot of people say to me, it's because you remained optimistic. It's because you didn't fall into hopelessness, you remained hopeful. You had kind of this camaraderie, and you were streetwise. You figured out how to survive on the street. You were resourceful. All of the above is true. But what it misses for me, and because I every time I didn't have the language for that, right, is that, in fact, it's purpose. Let me tell you why. So, growing up, one of the things that I realized as a young person, and it's, no one told me, but I just observed it. It's my mother, I concluded she was suffering. And it's interesting in that she never told me she was suffering. But because my father drank a little bit too much, I could see when she would say, for example, there's no money to get you this. There's no money to get you that. your father didn't leave money for, let's say, bread and milk, as an example. And I vividly remember, there are those experiences that sometimes you wonder why they are so dominant, in your upbringing. So for me, Joburg represented turning the fortunes for my mother. That really the main thing. Yes, I didn't think of my father, but not mostly. Yes, I thought of my siblings. For me, it was if I can only get a job that gives a decent salary, and I go home, I tell my mother, look what I managed to do in Joburg. That was the North Star. That was the purpose of not giving up, of fighting to the end, and eventually it worked out, right? I overcame homelessness.
I have to tell you, Frank, listening to that experience with your mother hitting you, it was her guilt and the fact that she couldn't.
Yes.
I know as a mother is that sometimes when I feel like I haven't done the right thing or I haven't been able to do what I wanted for my kids, I get angry.
Yes.
That's my response.
Yes.
And I just thought about your mom in that moment. She wasn't hitting you. She was hitting your father. And she was disappointed. She was hitting life that she couldn't do it for you.
And
so I thought that
Maya,
is what it was.
That's such a deep insight, because one of the things I realized as I grew older, I started appreciating my parents more. There was a time when I would be angry at kind of the journey that my father walked in his own, and kind of saying, but how he ended up drinking a little bit too much. What was going on there? He wasn't there for me when I needed him. But as I got older, I was just grateful, and I am still grateful. My father has passed on, but my mother is still alive. And I released them. I stopped judging them. I said, that's what they knew, and that's the parenting that they knew at that point in time. And so you're so right, Maya, about kind of that insight here. Came to me a bit late in my late 30s, but
We all, I'm telling you, I look at my sons and when they get upset or cross with me or complain, I just think, just wait, you'll get older and you'll start to appreciate me a lot more. But I want to move a little bit onto the sort of psychological money. You spoke, so you said about, you're teaching a masterclass and say to them, what are those money moments that make you or break you?
Yeah.
And you are obviously an expert in resilience and well-being, and this is what you're studying, you're teaching. What emotional scars do you think you still carry?
quite a few. And in fact, it's interesting how they came about, how I came to realize that I still have this scar. Let me give you the first one. So I got married soon after I finished my honors. I got married on 13 December 97, finished my honors end of November 97 at Wits. My wife was also doing a BCom there at Wits. And we started our life together. I had a job at Liberty Life. And then a couple of months into the marriage, let's call it April Horrible Days, 1998, I realized that there's a little bit of conflict in the house. I didn't know the language that it was about our backgrounds, but let me tell you the constant conflict. 4 months into this marriage, 4 or 5 months into this marriage. So we had bought a little fridge, and my wife grew up with this upbringing that things like milk and yogurt, it's very important to check, even to some extent bread, it's very important to check their best before that. So there was always this thing where she would take milk, she puts it on the side, she would take yogurt, she put it on the side, she's getting ready, tidying up to throw it away, right? And we would have a serious domestic, because I would say to her, and part of the time ashamed of how I used to do it. I had to learn later that wasn't the right thing. That wasn't the best way to do it. But I would really say to her, wait. What do you mean throwing it away? How do you know it's off? How do you know it's off? Like the way I'm doing, how do you know? And then I'll kind of get a spoon. And then I say, okay, let's check the yogurt. You're saying it's off? Okay, check, test, is it off? And we would always argue about that. It took me maybe a year to 18 months in this marriage that we saw best before date very differently. And it wasn't because she's a bad person, she grew up in this middle class and she wants to throw away things without checking. No, it wasn't that. It was more about me and my journey of hunger and many days and weeks of just not having something to eat, and you drink water to just kind of quieten the pangs of hunger, right? And so years later, when I started just trying to figure out, we used to have so much argument about food and I ended up realizing it's my food story. It's still with me. The best before date, to me, it's a suggestion. You can't just throw things away because someone says, it's best, right? That's the first one. And it's interesting that it took, in fact, almost arguments in the marriage and me reflecting on it to realize, right?
And that just actually makes me think, I must mention to our listeners, we must put the link in for the money questionnaire, because we have a money questionnaire that we give people, and it is about reflecting. And it is so powerful when you reflect on your money moments and you start to see what's driving today's behavior.
And can I tell you, Maya, one of the candidates did the money questionnaire, and I said, do it with your wife.
Yes.
He came back and he said, Mapalo, for the first time, I was sitting across my wife thinking to myself, do I know this person?
Yes.
Because it was the first time they reflected on each other's upbringing.
Yes.
But to your point, Frank, we often talk about money scripts or money vows, something that is so powerful that happens. And sometimes we're not even aware of it, right? Yeah. So I'll tell you, my money vow is I will never be broke.
Yes.
Right? Because of something that happened when I was younger. My parents couldn't pay for my fees. And I made a vow to myself. And it has played itself in such a way that, I was so fiercely independent when I got married. I did not want any help whatsoever. And with you, part of your manuscript was, I will not be like my dad, perhaps, right? And you went and you got a job. And one of the conditions is that you do not drink on the job. And you did.
Yes.
How did you feel about sort of repeating the very thing that you promised yourself you will not be and leading you eventually to lose your job?
Yeah, this is going back, maybe for the people who have read, no, this is not when he was at Liberty.
No.
This is part of the journey.
Yes,
he gets a job as a barman.
Kekhoed Hotel. I was in Kekhoed, in the Eastern Cape.
In the Eastern Cape, and it's an opportunity to earn some money, and you landed up helping yourself to some of the bar drinks, lose your job.
Yeah. And so that episode of my life, I've reflected a lot on it. And there's a couple of things that I want to share in response to your question, Mapalo. So the first one is that I now know that in most instances, when we say as people that I don't want to do that because my brother, was doing that, or in my instance, kind of my father drinks a little bit too much, or my mom, I've realized that it's a goal, it's an aspiration, it's an objective, but it's not underpinned by values. It's not underpinned by anything stronger than just a negative attitude towards that thing, like drinking, right? And so when I look back, I think that's part of why I ended up drinking, because it was just about, I don't want to be like that person. There was no why. Why? What's driving this not wanting to drink, as an example, right? That's the first thing I think that contributed to that. I think the second one is just naivety of youth, because I just felt, because it was my first job. I'd spent 6 months looking for work. I hadn't been able to find work in Uitenhage, in Kekhoed, and eventually I got this job as a barman. And so one of the things that I realized was I needed a sense of belonging, in that it was very difficult to really kind of engage and talk and laugh. I'm sober and everyone is a little bit tipsy. So I think that's kind of wanting to belong to these farm workers who come after a long day of hard labor and drink. I think that's probably the second thing, that contributed to it. And at the beginning it was, it's a little bit, it doesn't matter, right? So kind of that's the background to it. Then boom, it happens, and then I lose my job. And I want to take you to the moment. I describe it vividly in the book. The crying, the wishing I can turn back the hands of time. I made a mistake. I was unemployed for 6 months. And look what you've done. Really talking harshly to myself. not being kind to myself, judging myself, shaming myself, right, with the language I know now. But it's so interesting for me when I look back that I was quite fortunate that in that moment, I could almost hear a small voice, almost a resolution, almost a vow, if I use your word just now, that, you know what, I'm not going back to the farm. Because if I go back there, I'm going to be a farm laborer with Uncle Wandi. No. Where am I going? And the idea just came to Johannesburg because I've got a little bit of money. It was about 72 rands because they used to deduct breakages and, anything really that that they felt didn't add up to the stock that had, been there at the beginning of the month and kind of the money that I was when they took stock, right? And so the idea of, in the midst of the mistake, in the midst of this harsh talking to myself, I think I was quite fortunate. I haven't really figured out how that came about. This idea of let me go to Joburg. Perhaps it was, I guess, knowing how hard it was for Uncle Wandi and people who picked oranges on the farm. Because I'd come from Utenek, spent a few days there and could just see, and the job was there. I just didn't want to immediately take up the job of being a farm laborer. So maybe something was pushing me away. I don't want to work on the farms. Therefore, let me go to Joburg. And the journey started, yeah.
And I think it's so brilliant what you've said, is you said, I didn't want to be, you need to know the why. Yes. And you know what it reminded me of? If you're ever cycling, and they always say there's a pole and you don't want to hit the pole, don't look at the pole.
Yes.
Everyone looks at the pole, I don't want to hit it, and you hit it. Yes. You must look at where you want to go. Yeah. And I think that's possibly a really good analogy. Look at where you want to go, not where you don't want to go, and maybe you'll get direction.
Yes.
And the other thing I'm very interested in, Frank, is obviously your experiences today. Yeah. You came from a family of poverty, and you obviously there must be a feeling of giving back. How are you managing that as somebody who will be perceived? And let me tell you one thing I think nobody understands when you live perhaps in rural areas is how expensive it is to live in a city. And so it doesn't matter how much you're earning, there's very little extra. You've got to send your kids to school, you've got a home, you've got a wife, you've got all these commitments. How do you manage that? Because it is in your character to take other people with you. So how are you paying it forward? But yet, and again, I go back to our discussion with Professor Sarpong early in the last episode. How do you keep your portfolio? How do you manage all of those responsibilities?
Yeah. I think that's quite interesting because for me, when I look back at my growing up, there's always things that I wanted, they were not there. There's things my siblings wanted, they were not there. And interestingly, one of the things is very simple. It's just that in my family, we never celebrated birthdays. Right?
Just birthday.
Never. I can even tell you after today, my mom doesn't know my birthday. She doesn't. I have to phone and tell you.
And say, hey, today's my birthday.
I'm 54 now, like what I did on 25. She doesn't know. It's just not our thing. It just wasn't there, right? And so I think reflecting on my journey and realizing that when I look back, people often ask me, let's say, what are the three big things, right, that we really challenged during the period of homelessness? So there's hunger, right? There is the temptation, if I can call it that, to give up. It's too much. I'm crying at Joburg Park. I'm sleeping in the toilets at Carlton Center. I don't think I can take it anymore. You're kind of going through that. Of these three, right? It's kind of the hunger and the fighting, giving up. The biggest for me is this. It was fighting a world that wanted me to be invisible. The longer you're on the street, just the image you have, stereotyping, stigma, right? Uneducated, they choose life on the streets, petty criminals, they sniff glue as examples, right? And so I think what it planted in me, we were talking earlier, right, around perhaps what was planted in me, food and my relationship with food. And even up to today, your food wastage is a big thing for me, right? And so what was also planted during that time was fighting to retain or to claim my dignity, right? In other words, saying, well, this is tough, but I must figure out a way to overcome it. 6 months into this, just imagine appearance of someone who hasn't changed clothes in 6 months. People have a very different view of you. You have to say to yourself, I matter. I don't know how to overcome it, but I'm not going to give up, right? And so I think that fight for, even though I didn't use that language, for dignity, to remain human, to belong somewhere, not just these homeless people, I think it made me acutely aware of suffering, of times when, as a human being, you go through challenges and it's difficult to find people to help you. And then you eventually find them in Evelyn, in my aunt Christine Jika, in Mrs. Zimmerman, in Kwaku as examples. And so, even though in my younger years, and probably even when we met, I probably was not what I am today. In really the older I've got, I am just stuck by how, for me, and I enjoyed the discussion with Professor Sapong because you're talking about masculinity, right? And identifying yourself as a man. I've noticed a shift in myself. Let's say in the last decade, I strongly identify with just human. I'm human. Humans matter. Humans make mistakes. Humans go through up and down. And so my lens, when I see someone on the corner of Creston and Rivonia and they've got a board, help me, the first thing that comes to me is just, this person didn't grow up saying they ever wanted to be like that. Something profound happened. And then I've got a tinge of pain that I can't help all these people who need support like this individual. I can't be their Mrs. Evelyn. Sorry, their Evelyn. I can't be their Mrs. Zimmerman, as example. So I think my experience, and because I guess of the journey that I walked and doing relatively well in corporate, I think it made me so aware how it's so easy to attribute success to yourself. I'm clever, I've got a master's in software, I've got this, I've got that. But that would not be the full story. The full story is it took someone seeing me, my aunt. It took someone, Evelyn, Mrs. Zimmerman, and kind of helping me put that first foot on the ladder, kind of to success, right? And so that comes, Maya, your question, with a huge responsibility. And for me, that responsibility, firstly, is internal. It's really having to remind myself. It's putting boundaries in my helping, right? I'm better at it now than maybe a decade or 15 years ago. Because at some point, I was just so consumed with really wanting to be someone's Evelyn, wanting to point, there's Mapalo, she was homeless, I helped her. I've never been able to do that. Never, I can tell you, right? But what I've been able to do is a couple of things. One is to put boundaries, to say, the problem is so huge. Don't put it on your shoulders to help every single homeless person, right? That started shifting maybe about 15 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago. That was the first real. I was consumed by wanting to help. Who can I help? I must, to an extent where it was a stressor. I was now not enjoying life, not parenting well, because I was even to my kids, I would say, do you know how many people struggling out there? We can't just be doing this, That was the first thing. The second thing, Mapalo, was this. I realized, often people talk about it as the starfish principle, right? I realized I didn't need to end homelessness. It's nice if we can do it as a society, but what I can do is give someone hope. It's what Evelyn did for me, what Mrs. Zimmerman did for me, right? And so I started little things like, I'm the person at the traffic light. I open the window. If there's a little bit of leftovers from eating out, I give someone. If I always have a little bit of money in the car, I can give money. I run a lot and I always carry notes, money, 50 Rand, 20 Rand with me. And you may wonder, but that's not taking someone off the street. I agree it's not. But do you know one of the things that I so much wanted when I was homeless, but I didn't get it? Especially month 5, 6, 7. It was just conversation with normal human beings.
Being treated, not being invisible.
Yeah.
Not being invisible. Not being the homeless person. Remember, homelessness, it's an experience I'm going through. My identity is human. All our identities, we're human. and you have multiple identities, right? As the good prof was saying. But often what happens is society and people mix the two. The experience of homelessness is an imposed identity. People then see uneducated, petty, thief or criminal, lazy to work, chose life on the street. So you have this identity that is imposed on you, right? And so I realized that whilst I can't end homelessness alone, we must do it as society, I can be the person who talks
Who sees.
to other homeless people, who sees them. And so I spend a lot of time driving around Joburg, stopping. And can I tell you one thing that tells me there's something in it? Every time I talk to someone, and then firstly, you notice I ask them their name. There's something to our names. And there is something when someone says, I spoke to someone now who bakes on Rivonia, just there by corner Rivonia and where Gibbs is. What is Gibbs on Melville? Gibbs is on 26 Melville. Yeah? So corner Melville and Rivonia. There's someone who bakes there. He says to me his name is Jeremiah. The way he said Jeremiah, right? And then we talk and then he talk. And I didn't have anything to give him. The fact that I stopped on the side of the road and we spoke, he said, as I said, no, cheers, good luck. Next time I've got something, I'll give you. He said, hey, Baba, wangenza umuntu. You know, you restored my dignity, right? And so I think there is small, again, we're talking about the idea of masculinity, right? And we can give in non-financial ways. There is me giving someone by restoring their dignity. But I have to put those boundaries, Maya, because often, like I said, it's about, because you know you were there, you want to help everyone, and then you want to give money, you want to give of your time. And so often my family would complain that, hey, who's your family, Baba? Is it the guys out there? Because you're spending so much time with the homeless people compared to us. So that's part of, I guess, the psychology you're talking about. You went through something, you really know what it feels, and you can't end it. So you have to put boundaries on how can I help or how can I even run my life without constantly feeling guilty when I see someone who's homeless.
Yeah.
Frank, this has been such an amazing conversation. And I mean, we could definitely do like part 2, and maybe will be an opportunity to do so. But for those listening, I think Mapelo and I both just absolutely loved your book.
Thank you.
And I really would encourage people to grab a copy. It's called Reclaiming Dignity, My Journey from Homelessness to University. I found it inspirational. Yeah. I learned so much about you despite knowing you for many years.
For so long.
And yeah, absolutely amazing. So thank you. And thank you for joining.
It was great to be here. And I guess just my parting message, really the idea of, let's see human beings who are being challenged by homelessness. Let's not make homelessness their identity.
Absolutely.